Hello, and good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm mostly just testing because I know you just had lunch, and I want to make sure everyone's still with me. So I am very excited to be a part of this panel, moderating this panel in particular. As a reporter and editor, I would say one of my favorite things to cover is the intersection of race and economics, in particular, the gaps that exist there. And one of the reasons I love covering it is because I think that there is this sense, even among minority groups, even among the most vulnerable groups, that if they just work hard enough, if they just go to the right school, if they just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, they will one day get to that place of the American dream where everything will be realized and they will have full equality and things will be great. And I think in the past few years, there has been a lot of research that has disproven that and has been getting more voice, and I would love to kind of talk about that first. So Mónica, I want to start with you and do a little table setting of the racial wealth gap, and who are the groups that are having the hardest times?
So, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to the center to have invited me here. And part of my research in terms of wealth gap has actually back up more in the story within the immigrant community and the Hispanic community. I think to answer quickly the question about wealth gap, the largest gap are between people, white people and people of color. But within the people of color, African Americans are the largest group affected by the wealth gap. And given my interest in research, I have a focus on Hispanic community and immigrant community within that issue. So my perspective is going to be on that using that lens. And within that lens, I think about the intergenerational effect and the intergenerational effect of children of immigrants, because when you talk about the Hispanic community, it's very hard to avoid the topics about immigrant issues and immigration regulations, and that how access to resources and access to spaces can limit not only the adults that are going to be limited by those regulations, but also their future generations. And we think that children of immigrants also seeing, as of today, a separation with other I'm And that is going to exacerbate for those groups in the future the wealth gap and accumulation. Specifically, I'm using the lens of health outcomes and health shocks. We were talking about how wealth can be a safety net for taking risk. And I thought about this, so people with more health can take financial risk, but they actually never take health risk. On the other side, people without health, or without wealth, they don't take financial risk, but on a daily basis, they take health risk. So in the long run, all these differences in how we take in risk without knowing about them can affect this separation intergenerationally, and also at the moment where individuals have to face health shocks or any differences in savings and wealth overall.
Yeah. Camille and Byron, I want you to weigh in. One of the pieces I did that shockingly received a lot of attention was I wrote a very quick piece on like a Martin Luther King Day once when people are not reading the internet. It's not a good day to publish things. But it was about intergenerational wealth. And it was about the idea that specifically in this case, black children who were born to upper middle class parents were not guaranteed to stay there. And in fact, were significantly more likely than their white peers to fall back into lower quartiles. So I'm wondering how you think about intergenerational wealth building. Byron, you want to go first?
Well, I think the facts are incredibly clear now. I mean, just at the macro level, it's 11 cents on the dollar of sort of a black household wealth to white household wealth. Even if you were to compare, for example, black married couples in their 40s, right, with college degrees, to white married couples in their 40s with college degrees, the difference is still something like 30 cents on the dollar. So it's much more extreme than earnings differentials. And so wealth matters because wealth is what allows you to make mistakes. So we talk about like rates of entrepreneurship, for example. and like different risk perceptions. I actually think people's risk perceptions are pretty accurate. It's just that people have very different risks. I mean, sort of, certainly African Americans, certainly, well, here's a great example. Black women, you can look in survey after survey within businesses, they have actually like very high like traditional sort of credentials in a lot of ways. If you survey data says they have more ambition. It's like who wants to prioritize rising to the top of the company and working. Black women poll higher than white men on all that. But in terms of social capital, in terms of mentorship, in terms of access, and then in terms of risk taking, is it your feeling that you can make a mistake, just give it a try, make a mistake, and just get back on your feet? There's a totally different risk perception, and I think there's a totally different risk reality. And so I think, and these things tie to very measurable economic concepts. Wealth is certainly one of them. Social capital is certainly one of them. As a data point on LinkedIn, you're 9 times as likely to get a job if you've been recommended by someone you know, right? So if you're living in a country whose de facto and de jure policy has been housing segregation, forever, and not less now actually than 30, 40 years ago, well then of course your social capital is going to be less connected. So we could talk about it all day long, but what I do think is good about talking about this is it is the intergenerational and the impact of sort of wealth and capital, but also how does this play out in actual labor markets and progression and earnings, because it has very, very tangible effects, so it replicates itself across generations.
Yeah, so I think what I would just add to what my colleagues have said, and by the way, I want to say that I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I want to thank the Washington Center for Equitable Growth for inviting me to this very important conversation. But what I would just add briefly to what Byron and Mónica have said is that the process of asset creation is very racialized in the country, and so when we think about assets, we often think about homes, and obviously Byron alluded to the residential redlining, but even more recently than that, if you looked at mortgages that were held by Black and Latino families prior to the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, most of those mortgages were subprime. And there were a number of ways in which families who bought mortgages prior to that were kind of basically set up to fail. So that's one area. So that process continued into this millennium. In addition to that, historically, there have been ways in which first Blacks and then later others were excluded from jobs that had benefits, either excluded from unions, actually, or just excluded from those types of jobs. And you can see that continuing with the rise of the gig economy and the sort of de facto service jobs now being kind of the jobs that people have to support their families, as opposed to jobs that people have as young people. So the ability to accrue assets that you can leverage into wealth continues to be a highly racialized problem in the US, and the effect of it is that the wealth creating mechanisms simply are just not available to families of color.
Yeah. I want to actually stay on that and go through kind of the life cycle. One of the things that I found most troubling as I was thinking about and reporting on, for instance, student debt and how it affects communities of color was the idea that while, yes, as an entire generation, as an entire country, we have taken on an insane amount of student loan debt, there is a return for some people on student loan debt, but especially for communities of color, there is such a high level of debt for people who did not actually graduate or graduated from programs that offer no actual return on that debt. So they're saddled with debt without the labor market outcomes that make that debt even remotely worth it. So now they have $20,000, $30,000 in the hole, but are still making minimum wage, are still struggling to get out of that. So I'm wondering how you all think about the effect of that. And Byron, I want to start with you. Or Camille.
Yeah, I just want to say something about the racial wealth gap. So there was some work that was done by Raj Chetty a couple of years ago, and he basically said that the racial wealth gap is pretty much, if you were able to deal with what happened to black boys in this country, you would completely eliminate the racial wealth gap. So one of the interesting factors, and this plays into your question about student loans and student debt, is that if you take black men and black boys out of the economy, which is essentially what happens, then you have mostly black women trying to earn incomes for black households. And Chandra has done some really excellent work that shows that black women are the ones who are more likely to go to kind of for-profit colleges because they are very ambitious and aspirational and want to actually make that income and end up being more saddled with that debt than just about anybody else. So the ways in which black families try to make up for the lack of black income from black men is also kind of cratered by the fact that these kinds of institutions prey on blacks and other minorities and other people of color, and therefore create a pool of debt that's very, very hard to escape.
Yeah. Byron.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things about that. I mean, the sort of failure of that particular system is, I guess, overdetermined would be the technical term, right? I mean, it's in the sense of we're not thinking about it the right way. We're not acting the right way. So first of all the kind of analysis of the incident, student debt, and is all done on an income basis, right? Not on a wealth basis. So you're missing. So even the way we talk about it and measure it and consider it is completely missing the biggest factor, because this is an investment in human capital. It's really a balance sheet item, not a P&L item, if you will, right? So thinking about it relative to wealth is really what we should be doing. And if you looked at it in that picture, I mean, it would be a far worse picture, right, for blacks and Latinos. So that's number one. But number two, we just kind of like the housing problem. There's an affordable housing problem and there's an affordable college problem, but there's just basically there's not enough housing, right, sort of close to jobs, and there's not enough high quality seats, right, in public universities and the like. So if you have this huge demand for sort of new skills, and then on top of it you insist very stupidly that the only way to express those new skills is to have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or whatever, and then you constrain the growth of degree granting institutions and the seats and quality seats, well, surprise, right? You get this sort of situation where it's musical chairs. There's only a certain number of seats. There's more people who need it, and so you open the door to mediocre, intentionally bad actors, unintentionally bad actors, like just a lot of low quality seats, and then you have a dynamic of sort of social capital and who knows what will actually get you somewhere versus who doesn't, and so yes, that I think also contributes disproportionately to people of color going into the places that seem like they could help you. They're certainly putting a lot of marketing dollars to tell you that this will be good for you, but because people know they need something, right? And they're not getting it. So the last thing I'll say about it is, in giving a monopsony to four-year degree granting institutions on the signaling of skills, we've sort of, this is what makes a lot of this possible. If you can do the job, you should get the job. There are many alternative routes to skills, and I think to developing skills. And one thing we haven't talked about yet, but a lot of the lower wage jobs that Mary Kay was talking about and sort of represents actually demand a lot of skills. Right, and if you actually look at the skills maps of those jobs versus jobs that might be it's partly a gendered thing, but like the jobs that are paying more in different contexts, the skill mix isn't that different. There's typically a relatively modest injection of sort of technical skills you would need that is something that is eminently financeable and fundable. And so I think we need to sort of flip, in a way, this market for learning to earning on its head. And I think we should start with the recognition of wealth, because even in that loop, what people need, you can finance education if it's something that will lead to a higher paying job. What you can't finance is the living expenses to get that education. So there needs to be some sort of income support matched to kind of education. It's almost like universal income to rise, like during the sort of the 6 months, 9 months, 12 months when you're on a path that can actually get you to a better job. How do you do that if you're a single parent, 2 kids, right? So, I mean, there's just many, many things we need to flip about the system.
We're going to come back to the skills
Okay.
question.
And I think it's something about when you're creating a policy, I mean, student loans are giving you access to education, but not necessarily access to quality education,
Right.
which is like what you're saying. And in part of that is this mismatch on those who have the resources and are able to match their skills or match the lack of skills with quality education, and those who want to compensate for that lack of skill and not finding those access. So there is this mismatch at that entry, and there is this mismatch even for those who graduate, a mismatch of finding jobs that are gonna show the return that they show for the average students. So in a just by chance, I ended up working in a evaluation of a program that was happening in St. Cloud area, as many suburban area, and we found out that women, female students were more likely to enroll in higher education. But when we were like, oh yes, great. But we started digging into it. They were enrolling in certificates and short programs, 2-year programs, and then we kept digging, and they were cosmetic, hairstylish, and then we find out, well, yes, people. We don't know what the opposite of the counterfactual of that person is, but obviously we're seeing this trend in which when you're having these programs that are kind of mentoring and giving information and also resources to prepare themselves to go to the next step that you think that is the next step, you still need to think, especially when you're creating policies that you think are offering access to something, you need to think about access to what? What is exactly you preparing for, and what is the access that you are allowing those people to have, and then because otherwise you may end up exacerbating the issues that you're trying to solve.
I want to take that idea of what are we preparing for and use it to talk a little bit about skills. I think there was a point in time, and I don't report as much as I used to, so it could still be going on, where we could not say the word skills gap enough times in a day. And I think there was a lot of misuse of the word, a lot of misunderstanding about what that means. So, Byron, I want to ask you, does a skills gap exist? And to the extent that one does, what does it say about the failure of our labor market and the way we are thinking about preparing people for actual work?
Yeah. So, you know, you noted it's a labor market, right? And like, markets are all about closing gaps all the time. There's always gaps in markets, right? There's mismatches, and like a lot of what markets do is, oh, there's not enough of this, so the price rises, right? And demand signals go out, and then people invest in making more of whatever that is, right? So it's not, the whole still skills gap thing is very tiresome, but it's sort of, because like at a technical level, of course, there's like a million gaps in skills. Like there's millions of gaps in skills at any moment in time, and like people are all trying to fill them, and you know what I'm saying? So it's sort of at some level, of course there is, but it's more if you're saying the thing that kind of gets the backlash is when business people are like wages aren't rising, oh skills gaps, or whatever, you know what I mean? Where that's backwards, of course, because if skills gap should mean wages are rising, right? I mean, that would be a thing you would do to fill a skills gap, is raise wages and make it more attractive to go into a certain field. And so, look, I worked with businesses for many, many years. There's actually a lot of institutional reasons. I mean, it's not all sort of grand conspiracy to sort of suppress the workers. A lot of it is just like bureaucratic, like slowness and whatever. There's a bunch of things. But the point is this: we're thinking about the skills gap backwards. The skills gap is the consequence of an opportunity gap, right? It's not the cause, it's the consequence. And basically, businesses are saying, rightly so, they want skills, they mean it, they're not lying, they want these new skills. But they're actually, if you look at the workflow of how they actually recruit people, they screen out most people before assessing their skills. Right, and increasingly use proxies like a bachelor's degree requirement to say before, not as an assessment of skill, but as a screen to say whose skills are worth assessing at all, right? So And just to give a statistic that's just crazy. So of all the, when a job that does not today, the incumbent in the job does not have a bachelor's degree, that person leaves, you repost the job. In 1 out of 4 times over the last 5 years, that job has been upgraded to requiring a bachelor's degree. So you are taking jobs off the market, making them inaccessible to people without bachelor's degrees at an extremely alarming rate. So 5 years ago, I first started to dig into this. At that time, 20% of administrative assistants had bachelor's degrees. And 2/3 of the new job postings for administrative assistants required a bachelor's degree to be considered for that job. So 80% of administrative assistants then could not apply for 2/3 of the new jobs in their field. So roll the tape forward 5 years. Now 33% of administrative assistants have bachelor's degrees. Oh, great, administrative assistants are upskilling. No, like administrative assistants that don't have bachelor's degrees have been frozen out of that part of the labor market, right? And new people are being brought in, and now 75% of the new job postings for administrative assistants require a bachelor's degree, regardless of what skills you have. And let's be clear about the racial component. When you put a bachelor's degree requirement on a job, you're excluding about 75% of African Americans, you're excluding over 80% of Latinos. By the way, you're also excluding over 80% of rural Americans. So it's across races. So this is a huge deal. And so in other words, you are creating a skills gap, right, by preventing it. And once you do that, it has all sorts of knock-on effects. Because if you can't get a job, right, through a high-quality, like say 9-month training course, that won't get you a job anyway, because it doesn't change your history. If you can get a job because of your skills, there's a way to get new skills. That's called learning. If you can only get a job through your pedigree, through your history, the only way to get new history is lying, right? So so either we're going to sort of assign Elon Musk to build a time machine and send everyone back to get college degrees, or we're going to stop using such a crude and such a highly racialized signal of skills. There are so many ways that skills can be assessed. And by the way, it should be assessed in a way that can tell you, here's what you need to do, here's what you're missing. Because that's the other thing, you can apply for 100 jobs and you don't learn a single thing, right? The reason markets are better than bureaucracies at a lot of things is because they learn faster. But in the labor market, people learn nothing. Certainly people who are not socially connected and who don't have these sort of credentials, they learn nothing. It is a I don't want to use any rude words, it is a Kafkaesque experience looking for a job. And to this very day, there's not a single one of the job search platforms that you could go in and say, hey, I know how to code, I'm looking for a job as a software developer, only show me the jobs of companies that won't screen me out. That functionality does not exist on any of the major job search engines, despite the fact that it exists for companies to screen those people out. So I'll stop. I have a lot more to say about this, but it is, I cannot overstate. Let's just say, not everything that can work will work, but everything that can't work won't work. We have a system that makes it absolutely impossible, right, for people to rise through their efforts, through their learning, and then we wonder why we have a skills gap. This is not something we should be wondering about, but something we should be fixing.
Yeah.
Camille, I saw you nodding vigorously.
Well, I think that was very comprehensive, so I'm going to let Monica go.
Well, I was going to just synthesize and summarize as like skill gaps when it's connected to race or class, then it's when we have an issue. I mean, the skill differences are expected in an economy. People being specialized and learning about a specific task, and we need everybody to have a society. But when we're expecting that someone fill a specific box, that's when we have a problem. It's like when I say I teach, and people think that I teach Spanish, then I just have to generally expect that, and it's actually what it happens every time. So you have this expectation about certain groups and certain people, the way they look, and doesn't matter whether I consider myself being Hispanic before coming to the US, because before coming to the US, I was just Venezuelan, I wasn't Hispanic. But falling into a specific block, and then that block having a specific expectations, it can also affect you and the way you're doing things through your process here. And then, I'm bringing this the impression of an immigrant who came to this country just 15 years ago and finding herself into changing the way she identified herself, because when I started here, I was just Mónica García-Pérez. And how I was expecting to be an economist, and I was expected in my head, but then how you're facing with the skill gaps, how that reflects into how people see you, and how that can affect, a person that was already coming to the US to do a PhD in economics. Imagine how can it affect a little girl or a young person in terms of decisions, just not even how the system is, but what is expected from that person, and what expectations she end up having for herself in the future. So those kind of things are subtle for some people and some obvious for others. So everybody's nodding, so it's obvious for you, and some others will say, I haven't expected that, so I haven't had that experience. So I think there is like the economics of it, and there's the social definitely aspect of it when you connect it to class and social and race, that is becoming the issue. Yeah.
So we're going to move on to the portion of the conversation about solutions and policies, but before we do that, I want to remind the audience that we are taking questions at the close of this session. So if you can go ahead and open up Slido and start putting those in. I know you are all Slido experts at this point, but you can put your name or not, but do go in there and go ahead and start queuing up those questions. Okay, so as we start thinking about this, one of the things that I think makes writing about and thinking about this topic so difficult, people used to call my beat the despair beat, because I just felt like I had bad news all the time, is trying to figure out, okay, so how do we change this? So much of the cause of racial wealth gap, of the lack of intergenerational mobility, of the skills issues are so deeply baked into our country and the way that it functions and the way that we evaluate people's worth. How we say that people are worthy of certain jobs, of living in certain places, of having certain things, that it can feel really, really daunting to try and work out. So I think I want to start with the labor market, and we talked a little bit about this. What needs to change, and what can we actually do policy-wise to change the way we evaluate workers? Byron, I'm sorry, I'm coming to you again.
Okay, so I think in the labor market, there needs to be, when we talk about policy change, it's actually policy and practices, because so much of the labor market is ruled by companies, not by government. Do you know what I mean? Like there's sort of protections, there's labor protections by the government, but in terms of the core structure, and I think some of that can be legislated, but some of it, it's trickier. So the combination, I would say, is so first of all, I think it's incredibly important that there be alternative pathways by which companies hire at large scale, and so that you do not have to have a specific 4-year, $80,000 credential. It can't be that the only way to get to skills, when there's so many other ways, it can't be the only way to do that is to go into debt if you don't have wealth and all that stuff. And I will take a place like DC. As Washington, D.C. gentrifies, right? Like, I mean, as the population mix changes, like more educated, more white come in, people talk a lot about what that does to housing, and it is terrible. There's a housing gentrification that's very damaging. But there's actually a labor market gentrification that's happening too. Because what could be happening is that, right, okay, sure, it's sort of, there's more demand for housing, that puts pressure, but there's also way more jobs, and local people would get more jobs, right? Because here they are, and there's like more, right, and there would be ways, on-ramps and ways for them to get it, except that what happens when this population changes is companies also then up their degree requirements, and it basically takes out most of the local population. So now not only can you not afford to live here, you actually can't get a job here, because even though there's more jobs, the mix of those jobs are such that they explicitly exclude you, right? And if you're talking about like Black DC, that's like 80% of Black DC is being like turfed out not only of housing but jobs. So I think this is something that actually, if we can't figure out how to stop that, all this opportunity zones, everything, it's all going to be gentrification, right? I mean, because it will drive people out. So you need to have not only investments in training, but in inclusive hiring too, and for real, at real scale. And there's stuff we're working on there, and policy can support it. Secondly, then, those pathways then do require, it does take time. Like, learning is hard, teaching is work, and like people need to get paid for it. And so how do you fund that? How do you finance that? And there, I think there absolutely needs to be much more. I mean, I think sort of maybe 100-fold increase in, maybe more than that, in kind of the availability of income support for working learners so that they can actually focus on this for a period of time. And some of that can come through companies, through higher education benefits, but some of it's going to have to come through the government. And I think on the financing of education, it shouldn't be, for this sort of thing, like aimed at the job market, it shouldn't be just strapped